Welcome to the deep dive. We've got the 2023 JPMorgan Chase Shareholder Letter here, and our job today is basically to translate this huge strategic document into something, well, usable, actionable knowledge.
Exactly. And it's quite the document.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this isn't just some corporate report talking about, their amazing numbers, though they are staggering. What was it? $162.4 billion revenue, almost $50 billion net income for 2023?
Right. Impressive figures.
But this letter from Jamie Dimon, it's actually more like a masterclass, a really wide-ranging look at global risks. It maps everything from conflicts to AI's future.
Yeah, the sheer scope is what makes it so valuable. We're kind of using it as a shortcut, really, to understand how one of the biggest players sees the world right now and how they're setting up their defenses against all that volatility.
So what's our mission here?
We're pulling out the key takeaways, the essential nuggets, focusing on three main things. First, what we're calling the macro storm, all those global risks.
Okay.
Second, the big disruptive forces, technology, think AI and regulation. And finally, how the role of a corporation like JPMC is changing, in the market and in society overall.
Right, let's start there then, the macro storm. What kind of world is this letter actually describing? Outside the bank, I mean. The tone feels, extremely cautious.
Oh, definitely. The environment is full of challenges, big ones. The letter is very explicit about the wars in the Middle East, Ukraine, the rise in terrorism, and these growing geopolitical tensions, especially with China.
Right.
But what really stands out, I think, is their perspective. They see the potential for the whole global order to restructure and the human cost of all this as way more important than just like the immediate hit to their profits. It's about the fundamental stability of the system they're worried about.
Wow, that's a pretty pessimistic baseline. But what about the U.S. economy specifically? Because that's felt surprisingly resilient, hasn't it?
It has, yeah. The U.S. economy does seem strong. Consumers are still spending. Unemployment's low. Job market's tight.
But there's always a but.
Well, the letter gives some critical context here. It argues this strength is being maybe artificially propped up by huge government deficit spending and the leftover effects of past stimulus.
Okay.
So the market sees this and prices in a soft landing, like 70 to 80% chance everything will be fine.
Wait, the market's that confident?
No.
But Dimon himself is saying, what is there one thing making him more pessimistic than the market?
He basically says the odds are a lot lower than that. His main point is that the U.S. is facing several persistent inflationary pressures that the market is just underestimating.
Such as?
Well, the biggest ones he lists are the sheer scale of current government spending, the global cost of remilitarization, restructuring supply chains moving away from China, and the massive investment needed for the green energy transition.
Right.
You put those four together. That sounds a lot more like stubborn inflation than a nice, easy, soft landing.
So what's the takeaway for you listening? If the head of one of the world's biggest banks is, well, this nervous, they must be bracing for something tougher than just a mild slowdown.
They absolutely are. The bank is preparing for a huge range of possibilities. That means being ready for interest rates from, say, 2% all the way up to 8%, or potentially even higher.
Wow.
And the worst-case scenario they actually mentioned by name, stagflation. That nightmare mix of a recession and high inflation.
Ugh.
Yeah, that's the one that guarantees bigger credit losses, lower business volumes, pretty much everywhere. So they're building this like financial fortress designed to weather storms, not just enjoy the sunshine.
And that preparation seems to have paid off, right? Especially thinking back to the banking mess in 2023. How did JPMC handle that? And specifically, what was the deal with acquiring First Republic Bank?
Right, the First Republic Bank, or FRB acquisition back in May 2023. That was a really key moment. It definitely helped stabilize the U.S. financial system when things felt pretty shaky.
And their take on why FRB failed is interesting, too.
It is. They say FRB didn't fail just because of bad loans, necessarily. It was more this toxic combination of bad risk management. Things like extreme exposure to rising interest rates.
Okay.
These large, unrealized losses in their held-to-maturity portfolio, and having way too many deposits concentrated with just a few wealthy clients.
Okay, hang on. We need to clarify that. For anyone listening, what exactly is a held-to-maturity portfolio, and why were unrealized losses on those assets so toxic?
Good point. So HTM assets are usually things like long-term bonds that the bank plans to just hold on to until they mature, until they pay back the principal.
Right.
Accounting rules let banks avoid marking these to their current market value every day if they genuinely intend to hold them. The toxicity, the problem, came when the Fed jacked up interest rates so fast.
Okay.
Suddenly, the market value of those older, lower-rate bonds just cratered. Huge paper losses, unrealized losses. But when customers, especially those big depositors who weren't fully insured, got nervous and started pulling their money out.
They needed cash.
Exactly. The bank was forced to sell those bonds at a massive real loss to get liquidity. And that cycle, that panic, is what triggered the failure.
That makes sense. A very clear example of systemic risk right there. So back to JPM's results. The acquisition helped calm things down, but it was also, well, pretty good business for them too, wasn't it?
Oh, incredibly good business. They booked an immediate accounting gain of $3 billion just from the purchase itself.
Wow.
And maybe more importantly, they significantly boosted their estimate of how much extra profit the FRB business would add each year. They first thought maybe $500 million, now it's closer to $2 billion annually.
Big difference.
Huge. Plus, they brought on board something like 500,000 former FRB customers. Great for market share.
So setting aside that specific crisis move, how was the bank's overall core performance? They talk a lot about having this fortress balance sheet.
Performance was incredibly strong in 2023. It was actually their 6th year in a row, setting a revenue record.
Yeah.
But the number I think you should really focus on is their ROTCE, return on tangible common equity. It hit 21%.
Okay, 21% ROTCE. For the listener, what does that actually mean in practical terms? Is that, like, way better than their competitors?
It really is. ROTCE basically measures how efficiently a bank uses its shareholders' capital to generate profit. And 21% for a bank this big, this complex, especially with all the regulatory pressures. It's exceptionally high.
So it signals.
It signals they're operating really efficiently, they're highly profitable, and their capital position is strong. It tells the market that their main businesses, consumer banking, investment banking, wealth management, all of it, are firing on all cylinders while still managing risk well.
Okay, so it sounds like they've tested the risks, proved their strength. But what about growth? Opportunity. The letter seems to position AI not just as, another tech upgrade, but as something truly revolutionary, a future engine.
Yeah, the language they use is almost over the top, but you feel it's intentional. They call AI extraordinary and possibly as transformational as some of the major technological inventions of the past several hundred years. They're literally comparing it to the printing press, the steam engine, electricity, the internet. That gives you a sense of how seriously they're taking it, how much they're investing.
And they're backing that up with actual resources.
Definitely. They've got over 2,000 AI and machine learning experts, data scientists working on this stuff. And it's not just theory. They already have over 400 AI use cases running in production.
Doing what kind of things?
Critical stuff. Personalizing marketing, detecting fraud much faster, refining their risk models. And looking forward, they expect generative AI to completely change how things are done in areas like software development, customer service, even boosting employee productivity across the board.
But that level of AI needs serious computing horsepower, right? This isn't just software. You need the infrastructure. So what's the plan for the cloud transformation to actually support all this AI ambition? Without it, the revolution kind of stalls, doesn't it?
That's precisely the point. Cloud is the foundation. You can't really unlock the full potential of all that data or deploy hundreds of AI models efficiently without modern cloud infrastructure.
So what are they building?
They've invested around $2 billion to build 4 completely new, state-of-the-art private cloud data centers right here in the U.S.
Private cloud. Interesting.
Yeah, and their internal target is pretty aggressive.
Yeah.
By the end of this year, 2024, they want 70% of their applications and 75% of their enormous data load migrated, either onto public cloud platforms or into these new private cloud environments. It's a huge shift away from their older, less flexible legacy systems.
All right, let's switch gears from tech opportunities to maybe regulatory challenges. This is where the letter gets pretty pointed, even feisty. It takes some strong shots at financial oversight and, well, its unintended consequences. What are the main friction points they call out?
Yeah, feisty's a good word for it. A big concern is just the sheer volume and complexity of all the rules put in place after Dodd-Frank. They specifically mentioned the CCRR tests. That's the Fed's big annual stress test being like 80,000 pages long.
80,000 pages.
Yeah. Their argument is that this level of complexity creates massive bureaucracy, but doesn't necessarily make the system demonstrably safer. But the real hot-button issue for them, the one they spend a lot of time on, is the proposed Basel III Endgame rules.
Right, Basel III. For listeners, remind us what that is and why JPM thinks the U.S. version is unfair.
Sure. Basel III is basically the latest set of international banking rules about how much capital banks need to hold against their risks. JPM argues the specific way the U.S. is proposing to implement these rules puts American banks at a disadvantage globally.
How so?
They estimate that the U.S. proposal would force JPMC to hold about 25% more capital overall, and that would make their capital requirements about 30% higher than what's being proposed for similar banks over in the European Union.
Okay, so why should the average person, consumer, investor care about bank capital requirements? How does that affect them?
Because fundamentally, it increases the cost of doing banking. These rules, especially the parts impacting market making. Yeah, the essential buying and selling banks do to keep markets liquid. Think about the huge U.S. government debt market, the stock market, about $137 trillion combined. These proposed rules could increase the capital needed just for that activity by 50% for the big banks.
And the effect is?
When you make something that essential 50% more expensive for the banks to do, those costs get passed on. Banking services become more expensive, maybe harder to access for everyone.
So if traditional regulated banking gets too expensive or too slow because of these rules, where's that financial activity actually go? And aren't the big banks partly responsible for this, having pushed for higher capital after the financial crisis?
That's the core tension, exactly. The letter argues pretty forcefully that this activity gets pushed out of the regulated system and into the less transparent, less regulated shadow banking world. And they list concrete examples of the negative effects for you, the listener. Potentially higher mortgage rates, especially for first-time buyers, higher costs for small business loans, even making retirement savings more expensive because asset managers have to pay more to trade, and more costly financing for government infrastructure projects.
So they're saying the rules are backfiring.
Their argument is that while strong capital is vital, these specific rules go too far and are actually counterproductive, pushing risk into darker corners.
And one of those corners is private credit.
Yeah, the rise of private credit gets special attention. It's booming precisely because it is faster and more flexible than bank lending under these new rules. It fills a gap.
But the downside?
The downside is it's much less transparent, especially how assets are valued. And here's the real kicker they point out. The massive private credit market has grown up entirely during a period of relatively benign economic conditions. It hasn't really been tested by a proper downturn, a bad market. When that stress test eventually comes, they warn, the weaknesses hidden in those less transparent, potentially riskier loans could suddenly become very apparent.
Okay, let's move from finance and risk to some of the non-financial stuff. The firm's social commitments. What were the key initiatives or policy ideas they highlighted there?
Well, they reported making over $30 billion in progress on that racial equity commitment they launched back in 2020. They hit that target by the end of 2023. And importantly, they say they're now embedding those programs permanently into how they do business.
Okay.
They also flagged some specific successful programs, like their big $200 million investment aimed at helping Detroit's recovery, and their ongoing programs supporting military veterans and their families.
The letter also gets into broader policy recommendations, trying to address what Dimon calls America's torn social fabric. What specific fixes are they proposing, particularly for lower-income people?
Two main ideas stand out. First, they want to dramatically expand the Earned Income Tax Credit, the EITC. They suggest making it a monthly payment instead of an annual lump sum, boosting the maximum credit you can get to $10,000, and importantly, getting rid of the requirement that you need to have children to qualify for the full amount.
Okay, wait. Why make it monthly, and why remove the child requirement? How does that help mend this torn fabric?
Well, the monthly payment idea is about smoothing things out. Right now, the EITC often comes as one big refund. Getting it monthly could really help families manage their budgets better throughout the year, tackling poverty more consistently, not just at tax time.
Makes sense.
And removing the child requirement. That targets single, low-income workers without kids. Often, they face some of the highest effective tax rates and get the least support from the current system. The goal is basically to make work pay better for all low earners, to strengthen that link between work and financial stability.
Interesting. What was the second big policy idea?
The second one is about connecting education directly to jobs. specifically linking high schools and community colleges much more closely to actual job outcomes and teaching the skills that are really in demand by employers right now.
Trying to close that skills gap we always hear about.
Exactly. Making sure the investment in education translates directly into good jobs.
Now, the letter also touches on some pretty controversial topics like energy policy and climate action. What was their reasoning for leaving groups like Climate Action 100 Plus True? Why go their own way?
Yeah, they stated they want to manage their own climate strategy internally now. Their core argument is that tackling climate change effectively really requires government policy leadership and huge amounts of capital. They estimate something like $5 trillion per year globally.
So government needs to lead.
That's the implication. And they stress this need to balance the transition to cleaner energy with ensuring energy remains affordable and reliable now. They also included a sharp political comment, criticizing the U.S. decision to pause approvals for future liquefied natural gas (LNG) export projects. They called that move naive.
Why naive?
Their point is it hurts American allies who need that energy, potentially forcing them to rely more on countries that might be adversaries.
Yeah.
It's a geopolitical argument layered onto the energy one.
Okay. And finally, there was this kind of surprising critique aimed at the U.S. public markets themselves. Surprising coming from a pillar of Wall Street.
It really was. It's basically a lament about how much the number of publicly listed companies in the U.S. has shrunk, from around 7,300 back in 1996 down to only about 4,300 now.
And who do they blame for that decline?
A few things. Burdensome regulations, the constant threat of shareholder lawsuits, and this was interesting, what they call the undue influence of the big proxy advisory firms.
You mean ISS and Glass Lewis?
Exactly. They point out both are foreign-owned and argue they have too much power swaying corporate governance votes. So, partly in response, JPMC says it's beefing up its own internal process for proxy voting, trying to give their actual portfolio managers more say and rely less on those external recommendations. #outro.
You know, what's really striking when you pull it all together is how consistent the roadmap is. They're clearly identifying global instability and these regulatory headwinds as the big external threats.
Right.
While at the same time, they're doubling down internally on getting that technological edge with AI and the cloud and just maintaining that incredibly strong fortress-like financial base.
So tying it all together, what does this mean for you listening? This letter gives you a pretty stark assessment of the world, actually. It suggests America's global standing is under real pressure, that the domestic economy is kind of running on borrowed time fueled by government spending, and that the financial system itself is shifting, activities moving away from the regulated banks towards these less transparent private markets.
That shift is key.
Which leads us to maybe the final provocative thought for you to consider. We have public markets shrinking, partly due to regulatory and governance pressures. At the same time, you have this booming private credit market that, as we discussed, hasn't really faced a true baptism by fire or really bad market stress test.
Not yet.
So the question is, how will regulators, how will the system manage the eventual collision between these two diverging financial worlds, especially if or when that stagflation scenario they worry about actually materializes? Definitely something to mull over as you navigate the current financial landscape.